The flood had come suddenly, leaving Emily in shock. By morning, the water had receded, but her house was a mess. Mud coated the floors, furniture floated aimlessly, and the smell of wet earth clung to everything. Emily stood in the middle of her living room, feeling powerless. Her favorite rug was ruined, the sofa soaked and sagging, and the curtains, once bright yellow, were now dripping and heavy. Photographs of her family, some torn, others smeared with mud, lay scattered on the floor. She tried to take a step forward, but her boots sank slightly into the damp carpet. A wave of despair hit her, and for a moment, she thought everything she had worked for was gone. She sank to the floor, running her fingers through the mud, feeling the weight of loss. The house felt empty, and even the silence was oppressive. It wasn't just her home that had been damaged. A part of her spirit had also been swept away by the floodwaters. She thought about the long hours she had spent decorating, painting, and creating a space she loved, only to see it reduced to chaos in a single night. Tears stung her eyes, but she wiped them quickly. She knew crying alone wouldn't fix anything, yet she couldn't stop the trembling in her chest. Then she heard the familiar crunch of boots on the wet floorboards. Her grandfather, Thomas, had arrived. At 80, he was older than she remembered. His back bent slightly, but there was a quiet strength in his movements. He carried a large, sturdy bucket in one hand and a mop in the other, looking around the flooded room with a steady gaze. He didn't panic or sigh at the destruction. Instead, he nodded once, like he had already accepted the challenge. "The water may have taken much, Emily," he said softly, "but it didn't take us. That means we can still rebuild." Emily blinked, unsure if she could believe him. The room looked beyond repair, and yet hearing his calm voice stirred something inside her. He set down his bucket and started moving through the mess with careful steps, showing her by example that action was possible even when everything seemed lost. She watched him work silently for a moment, admiring the way he approached the disaster not with anger or frustration, but with patience and purpose. His hands were worn and knotted with age, yet they moved with surprising agility, picking up the lighter items, stacking ruined books, and moving photos to a dry corner. "Where do we even start?" Emily asked, her voice shaking, half from cold, half from fear. Thomas looked at her and smiled gently. "One step at a time. Start with what can be saved. The rest can wait." They began sorting through the scattered belongings. Emily grabbed a photo of her parents and wiped off the mud carefully, placing it on a small, dry table. Her grandfather moved a soaked armchair to the porch to dry. The rhythm of working together brought a strange comfort. The chaos was still overwhelming, but with each item they lifted, the room felt slightly lighter. Emily realized that the flood hadn't just destroyed material things, it had also shaken her sense of control over life. Yet having her grandfather there made the disaster feel like something manageable as they continued. Emily's mind wandered to memories of floods in her childhood, when Thomas would guide her through heavy rains, teaching her how to stay calm and organized. Back then, it was a game, but now, as adults, the lessons felt real and urgent. She noticed the determination in his eyes, a quiet resilience that told her he had faced far worse before. The thought steadied her trembling hands, and she felt a small spark of hope. Hours passed quickly as they worked side by side. Thomas hummed an old tune, one Emily recognized from her childhood. The song brought a warmth to the cold, muddy house, making it feel less like a disaster zone and more like a place still full of life. Emily began to hum along, her voice shaky but gradually stronger. The work was tiring, but it carried a strange sense of healing. Each mop stroke, each bucket of water carried out, felt like washing away more than just mud did, was also a cleansing of fear and helplessness. Despite the hard work, Emily's emotions ran deep. She thought about the boyfriend she had recently lost, how she had invested her heart fully, and then watched it crumble. That heartbreak had left her feeling vulnerable, and now the flood seemed like a cruel echo of that loss. Yet as she looked at her grandfather's calm/steady movements, she realized that loss didn't have to mean the end. There was a way forward, and someone experienced could show her how. She glanced at Thomas, wondering silently if he could sense the storm inside her as clearly as he saw the flood around them. The sun shifted, casting a warm golden light into the ruined living room. Mud-stained curtains now hung at odd angles, and the floorboards were barely visible under scattered debris. Yet there was a sense of rhythm in the chaos. Emily began to feel that maybe, just maybe, this mess could become something new. She even found herself smiling faintly when her grandfather cracked a joke about the flooded furniture. Olympics, lightening the mood by late afternoon. The worst of the cleaning was done. Some furniture was saved, some ruined beyond repair, and photographs had been rescued from the mud. Emily leaned against the doorway, exhausted, but a quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. Her grandfather sat nearby, brushing his hands off on an old towel, and for a moment, they both just watched the room in silence. The house was still far from perfect, but it had survived. So had they not, Thomas broke the silence. Emily, remember this. Storms in life don't define us. How we respond does. You've done well today. Emily's throat tightened. His words felt like more than praise. They felt like a message about life itself. She had survived heartbreak, and now with his guidance, she could survive the flood too. There was a strange, comforting rhythm in the chaos. A reminder that even when the world seemed to crumble, love, patience, and guidance could rebuild it. As they prepared to leave the living room for a short break, Emily looked around one last time. The floodwaters were gone, but their impact lingered. Still, she felt lighter, stronger, and strangely hopeful. The disaster had forced her to face despair. Yet it also offered her a chance to rebuild not just her home, but her spirit. And in that moment, Emily realized that her grandfather's presence was more valuable than anything in the ruined house. He had arrived with tools, buckets, and wisdom. But he had given her something more enduring: hope, resilience, and a glimpse of the love that still existed in the world. She knew the flood was far from over in her life story. But with him by her side, the path forward seemed possible. The day had begun in loss and uncertainty, yet it ended with quiet strength and the first hint of restoration. Emily took a deep breath, letting the sense of calm and purpose wash over her. And she prepared herself for the next stage, the hard work of rebuilding Anne, perhaps. Discovering the parts of her heart she had kept hidden, ready for life to return again. The afternoon sun poured through the broken curtains, casting streaks of light on the muddied floor as Emily and her grandfather worked in quiet rhythm. Emily's arms ached from lifting soaked furniture, and the sweat on her brow mixed with the smudges of dirt on her cheeks. But despite the exhaustion, there was a strange comfort in the shared labor. Thomas moved with steady purpose, humming softly as he wrung water from a sodden rug, his old hands surprisingly nimble. Emily found herself watching him, noticing the small details, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the calm steadiness in his movements, the patience that seemed to have no end. "Emily," he said, pausing to catch his breath. "When storms come, it's easy to lose sight of what matters. You see all this mess, and it's hard not to feel hopeless. But the house isn't the heart of home you are. And the heart stays even when the walls get wet." She looked up at him, surprised at the gentleness in his tone. She had expected orders or tips on cleaning, but instead he was giving her wisdom, as though every stroke of the mop carried a lesson. Emily nodded, letting his words sink in. They were true. She had been so focused on the destruction that she had forgotten she could still choose how to respond, still find strength in the chaos. As they moved through the living room, sorting damaged items from those that could be saved, memories came flooding back. She remembered sitting in this very room as a child, listening to her grandfather tell stories of his youth, the adventures he had, the mistakes he learned from, and the love he had lost and found again. Those stories always had a way of comforting her, reminding her that life was bigger than small tragedies. Now, in the middle of mud and ruin, those lessons seemed more real than ever. "Here," Thomas said, handing her a photo frame covered in mud. "This can be cleaned. Let's not give up on it." Emily took the frame and carefully wiped the dirt away, revealing the smiling faces of her parents at a family picnic. She felt a pang of emotion, memories both joyful and bittersweet. But she smiled despite herself. Each recovered item felt like reclaiming a piece of her past, a reminder that not everything was lost. While they worked, Thomas hummed a tune Emily hadn't heard in years. She began to hum along quietly, her voice tentative at first, then gaining strength. The sound of it in the ruined room made her heart feel lighter. For the first time since the flood, she allowed herself to breathe without that tight knot of despair in her chest. There was something about shared effort, about moving through mess and chaos with someone who cared. That healed more than she could have imagined. "Do you remember?" "Emily," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "When you thought you couldn't climb that big hill behind our house as a kid? You kept stopping, getting frustrated, thinking you'd never make it. But you did. One step at a time, just like now." Emily chuckled softly, imagining her younger self throwing her hands in the air in frustration. "I guess so," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. She didn't mention that life had been full of hills lately, emotional ones she hadn't known how to climb. The breakup from her long-term relationship had left her feeling fragile. And the flood only amplified the emptiness she carried inside. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet safe at the same time. Thomas gave a small, knowing smile, noticing her hesitation. Sometimes the hardest things in life come in floods, not water, but heartbreak. They wash away what we think is permanent. But that doesn't mean we're lost. It just means we have to rebuild, stronger than before. Emily's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't panic. It was the stirring of something she had nearly forgotten: hope. She glanced at him, this man who had always been steady and wise, and realized that the lessons he had imparted as a child were still true. Strength didn't come from avoiding storms, it came from facing them and choosing to keep moving. They continued, space steady but tiring. Muddy water was poured into buckets, furniture dragged to safer corners, and broken items set aside for later. Emily found herself talking more freely, telling her grandfather about the recent heartbreak, about how lonely she had felt, about the fear that love might never return. He listened, never interrupting, his presence enough to let her speak. When she paused, unsure what to say next, he simply nodded and offered a soft word of comfort. "Love," he said gently, "is like this house after the flood. It can be shaken, it can be torn, it can feel like it's gone forever. But if you nurture it, if you're patient, it can survive and even grow stronger. You just have to be willing to try again." Emily felt her heart stir in ways she hadn't expected. She thought about the person she had loved and lost, about the walls she had built to protect herself, and about the courage it might take to let someone new in. The flood had destroyed so much, yet she realized that some things, like her grandfather's wisdom and her own capacity to hope, could not be taken away. The hours passed quickly, though Emily hardly noticed. There was a rhythm to the work, a flow that brought peace despite the mess. They laughed softly at small mishaps and knocked over bucket. A stubborn rug butt, each laugh felt like a victory over the despair that had threatened to overwhelm her. Every item they salvaged, every corner they cleaned, was a step toward reclaiming not just the house, but herself. By late afternoon, the room looked markedly better. Muddy patches remained, but the worst was gone. Sunlight now streamed through the partially cleaned windows, and for the first time that day, Emily felt a spark of pride. She had faced the chaos, endured the exhaustion, and discovered a quiet strength she hadn't realized she possessed. Thomas leaned against a doorframe, wiping his hands. "See, step by step, it's done. And you did more than just clean. You faced the fear that the flood brought, and you kept going. That's strength, Emily. That's wisdom." Emily felt a lump in her throat. He wasn't just praising her for work. He was teaching her something far deeper. She realized the flood had become a mirror, showing her the resilience she hadn't believed she had. Her grandfather's presence, steady and encouraging, had turned the chaos into a lesson, a bridge between despair and hope. As they sat for a short break, sipping cold water and looking around the room, Emily felt a warmth she hadn't felt in months. The house was far from perfect, but it was no longer defeated, and neither was she. In that moment, she knew the flood was not the end of her story, was the beginning of a new chapter. one where she could rebuild not just her home, but her heart. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting golden light across the room, Emily realized something extraordinary. The flood may have taken possessions, but it had given her clarity, resilience, and the quiet, steadfast presence of her grandfather, a presence that could heal not just broken furniture, but broken hearts. The evening settled quietly over the house, the golden light of sunset streaming through the windows and casting a soft glow over the partially cleaned living room. Emily sat on a chair, her hands still damp from the work, watching her grandfather move slowly but steadily around the room. The flood had left its mark, yet there was a sense of order emerging from the chaos. A fragile promise that life could continue, that the house could heal, and perhaps, so could she. Thomas leaned against the wall, breathing deeply after dragging a heavy piece of furniture to the porch. He wiped his hands on a rag, then looked at Emily with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades of experience. "You know," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "when I was your age, I thought I had lost everything I loved. Not to a flood, but to life itself. There was a woman I cared for deeply, and I was convinced she was my forever. But things fell apart, and I was left feeling hollow, thinking I'd never recover." Emily's fingers paused mid-wipe. She had never heard this story before. Her grandfather, who always seemed so strong and unshakable, had once known heartbreak. Her heart softened as she watched him, realizing that strength was not the absence of pain, but the ability to continue in spite of it. "I wandered for a long time," Thomas continued, "thinking my story had ended. I couldn't see the way forward. I thought love had left me for good. And then, when I least expected it, someone new came into my life. She taught me that even after loss, there is still room for love, for hope, for joy. That lesson stayed with me for the rest of my life." Emily's chest felt tight. The words resonated deeply. She thought about the recent heartbreak she had endured, the loneliness that had settled in since the end of her relationship. For months, she had believed that love had passed her by, that perhaps she had lost her chance at happiness. But now, sitting here, listening to her grandfather's quiet truth, a spark of hope flickered in her heart. Her grandfather paused as if considering whether to continue. Emily dared to ask, her voice barely above a whisper, "Did it hurt a lot?" Thomas nodded slowly, a shadow crossing his face. "Yes, it hurt more than I thought I could bear. But pain teaches us something. It teaches us who we are, what matters, and how to keep going even when it feels impossible." He smiled then, the lines around his eyes softening. "And it reminds us that the heart is stronger than we give it credit for. You'll understand this one day if you haven't already." Emily swallowed hard, feeling tears threaten to fall. There was a gentle warmth in his words, a quiet encouragement that made her feel understood. She had never realized how much she needed this someone to remind her that pain was not the end, that life could surprise her, even when she thought she was broken. Thomas stepped closer, picking up a damp rug. "Emily, look at this," he said, showing her a corner that had been especially muddy but was now nearly clean. "It's not perfect, but it's improving. Step by step, it gets better. That's life too. Your heart, your home, your happiness, they all need care, patience, and time, and you're capable of that." Emily felt her throat tighten. The flood had destroyed so much, but in these quiet moments, she realized that it had also cleared space to rebuild not only the house, but herself. She thought about the walls she had built around her heart, the fears she had kept hidden, and suddenly she wanted to trust, to open herself to life and love again. "Grandpa," she said softly, "how did you know it would be okay? After everything?" He looked at her with eyes full of kindness and experience. "I didn't know. I just kept moving forward. I did what I could, one day at a time. Sometimes that's all we can do. The rest comes in its own time." The room was silent except for the distant sound of water dripping from the ceiling and the faint rustle of trees outside. Emily watched the light shift as the sun dipped lower, painting the walls in soft shades of orange and gold. She felt a gentle stirring in her chest, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something more tender she could not yet name. Her grandfather had always been a figure of strength, but now she saw him differently, not just as family, but as someone whose wisdom could guide her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found herself thinking about the lessons hidden in the flood, in the heartbreak, and in this shared labor. The water had been destructive, but it had also stripped away pretense and revealed what truly mattered: resilience, love, hope, and the bonds that carry us through the hardest times. Her grandfather's stories, his calm demeanor, and the quiet ways he offered support made her feel safe, enough to imagine a future where happiness and love could return. "Emily," Thomas said, breaking her reverie, "don't let loss convince you that life is over. Storms, heartbreaks, floods, they all feel like the end. But endings are only beginnings in disguise. You have the power to rebuild, to recover, to find joy again. And when you do, you'll see the beauty of it, all the depth of your own heart and the strength you never knew you had." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks silently. There was no shame in them. These were the tears of someone who had carried heavy burdens and was finally letting a little light in. Emily realized that she had been clinging to fear, to the idea that love and happiness were beyond her reach. But here, with her grandfather beside her, the walls around her heart began to feel less rigid, more willing to bend and let warmth in. The sun disappeared completely, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of evening. Shadows danced across the floor as they continued their work, side by side, moving furniture, cleaning surfaces, and salvaging memories. Each action, simple as it seemed, carried a weight of intention and care. Emily felt an unfamiliar but welcome courage rising inside her, courage to face not just the flood, but her own doubts, her own fears, and perhaps even the chance of new love. By the time they paused for a short rest, the living room was transformed. Not fully restored, but much of the destruction had been cleared, leaving a space that felt alive again. Emily looked at her grandfather with newfound respect and quiet awe. His presence was a steadying force, a reminder that even in moments of despair, wisdom, patience, and love could guide her forward. "Grandpa," she whispered, almost to herself, "thank you for everything." He smiled softly, as if he had been expecting it, and said, "You've done the hard part, Emily. You've faced the storm and taken the first steps to rebuild. The rest? That's up to life and you. But I promise, the heart is resilient. It always finds its way." Emily leaned back, letting the weight of his words settle in. She felt a mix of exhaustion and peace, heartbreak and hope, and an unspoken sense that life, despite its floods and losses, still had beauty and love to offer. And as night settled over the house, she realized something important. The flood may have damaged her home, but it had also opened the door to healing, understanding, and perhaps a second chance at the heart she thought she had lost. Night had settled over the town, but inside Emily's house there was a quiet warmth. The flood had left its mark walls stained with mud, furniture still damp, and the air carrying the lingering scent of wet earth, but it no longer felt like defeat. Emily and her grandfather, Thomas, sat side by side on the porch, catching their breath after hours of hard work. The living room, though far from perfect, had been transformed. What once felt like ruin now carried hints of possibility. A space where life could be rebuilt piece by piece. Emily sipped her tea, feeling the warmth seep into her tired hands. She watched Thomas carefully folding a damp blanket, and a soft smile touched her lips. He moved with purpose, but there was also gentleness in every action, quiet rhythm that seemed to calm her own restless thoughts. For the first time since the flood, she felt a sense of peace. The chaos of the day had faded, replaced by a calm clarity that reached deep inside her heart. "Grandpa," she began hesitantly, "how do you always know what to do, even when things seem impossible?" Thomas looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't always know," he said softly, "but I've learned that when life feels overwhelming, you focus on what you can control, one small thing at a time. You can't undo what's lost, but you can choose how to respond. That's where strength comes from. Emily nodded, letting the words sink in. They resonated in ways deeper than she could have anticipated. She thought about the heartbreak she had endured recently, the way she had closed her heart to protect herself. For months, she had believed that love and happiness were out of reach. And yet, here she was, listening to her grandfather speak about resilience and hope, feeling the first stirrings of belief that she could open herself. Again, the porch was quiet except for the distant sound of water dripping from a broken gutter and the occasional rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Emily leaned back, letting herself breathe for the first time in hours. She realized that the flood had not just damaged her home, had uncovered truths she hadn't been ready to see. Strength wasn't about never falling. It was about rising each time you did. Love wasn't about avoiding heartbreak. It was about being willing to trust again. Thomas glanced at her, reading the mix of emotions on her face. "You know, Emily," he said, his voice softer now. "When I was young, I thought I had lost my chance at love forever. I was heartbroken, thinking life had nothing left for me. But life has a way of surprising us. And sometimes, the things we think we've lost are waiting to return in new forms." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. His words reminded her of the courage it would take to trust again, to allow herself to love and be loved. She had been so afraid of disappointment that she hadn't realized hope could still exist within her. Now, with her grandfather beside her, she felt the first gentle nudge of that hope. "I guess that's why you've always been so patient with me," she said quietly. "You know, life isn't always easy, but you help me see the way forward." Thomas smiled, little tired but full of quiet pride. "You're learning, Emily, and that's the important part. Strength, wisdom, love, they all come from experience. You can't rush them, but you can recognize them when they appear. And you're doing that right now." Emily's heart swelled. The flood had destroyed so much of her physical world, but in this moment, it had rebuilt something inside her, a renewed sense of self, courage, and trust. She looked at her grandfather, seeing not only the years etched into his face, but also the quiet power of a man who had lived through storms, heartbreak, and loss, yet had chosen hope every time. She realized that what he offered was more than guidance. It was a reminder that life, no matter how messy or painful, still had beauty to offer. They rose together and stepped inside to check on the living room one more time. The sunlight was gone, replaced by the soft glow of a lamp, but the transformation was evident. The floor was mostly dry, the furniture arranged thoughtfully, and the salvaged photos and keepsakes neatly placed on tables and shelves. The house wasn't perfect, but it had survived on, so had Emily. Thomas paused in the doorway, watching her take it all in. "See, Emily," he said softly, "it's not about perfection. It's about progress, about showing up even when it's hard, and about believing that better days are ahead." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. She had been afraid of the unknown, afraid of loss and disappointment, but now she felt a quiet courage rising in her chest. She realized that love, life, and happiness were not gone. They were simply waiting for her to reach for them. As they sat together in the soft light, Emily felt a shift inside her. The sadness and fear that had clouded her heart began to lift, replaced by a gentle warmth that spread through her chest. She thought about the person she had loved and lost. And while the memory still brought a sting of pain, she also felt gratitude for the lessons learned, for the moments that had shaped her, and for the chance to open her heart again. Her grandfather glanced at her, noticing the change. "Emily," he said, his voice gentle, "life has a way of washing away what we think we need to hold on to, but it also gives us the opportunity to see what truly matters. You've worked hard today, not just cleaning the house, but preparing your heart for what comes next. And I can tell you're ready for it." Emily felt a lump in her throat, a mixture of emotion that was both tender and hopeful. She realized that the flood, despite its destruction, had been a turning point. It had stripped away the illusion of control she thought she had, but it had also revealed resilience, love, and possibility. Her grandfather's wisdom had guided her through it, and now she could see clearly that the future, both her life and her heart, was hers to shape. The night deepened, and the house felt calm and safe. Emily sat with her grandfather, holding her tea, feeling the weight of the day lift. The flood had been a storm of destruction, but it had also been a storm of revelation. She had learned patience, courage, and the quiet power of hope. She had discovered that even when life seemed cruel, love and happiness were not lost. They were simply waiting for her to reach out and embrace them again. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. The flood had taken possessions, disrupted her life, and challenged her spirit. But it had also given her a gift far greater than any material thing: clarity, resilience, and the chance to open her heart once more as the lamp's soft light filled the room. Emily looked at Thomas, gratitude and love shining in her eyes. He returned her gaze, a gentle smile on his face, and in that quiet moment, words weren't necessary. She understood that life, love, and family were what mattered most, and that storms, no matter how fierce, could not take those away. The flood had ended, but a new chapter had begun. Emily knew the journey ahead would not always be easy. But with her grandfather's wisdom, her own courage, and the lessons she had learned that day, she felt ready. She could rebuild her home, and she could rebuild her heart. And perhaps, in time, she could find love again, not lost, but renewed, stronger, and full of possibility.